wel in. We zijn hele kunnen, dus met een betel eerst begonnen.
If you've been on this channel before, you'll know that we bought a farm with one house and 3 other buildings. 3 families in one house, that wasn't an option for us. However, we had to sell all our houses to be able to afford this place. After gathering some information and looking at different options for temporary housing, we decided to get tiny houses. It's a hype, so new tiny houses can amount to 80,000 euros. Luckily, we found some tiny houses second-hand. Both are built out of 3 shipping containers and equipped with windows, doors, a kitchen, a bathroom and 2 bedrooms. We got them from other people who lived in the tiny houses during their renovations. It was decided fairly quickly that Jasper and Daisy and their 2 kids would move into the house, and Andreas, Morgan, Alex and Eline would be living in these tiny houses. The long-term plan is to renovate one of the barns into 2 homes, but that will be a multiple-year plan. So we needed comfortable housing in the meantime. The reason we went with the tiny houses is twofold. First off, we wanted to be on the domain, live together and also being able to oversee the renovations. And second, in the long run, it's cheaper than renting because we plan to sell the houses second-hand after the renovations. Finding the tiny houses wasn't the hard part, the transportation was. Not every transportation company is equipped to move an entire house across the country. After a lot of calling back and forth and measuring entranceways onto the domain, we found 2 transport companies. One to pick up the tiny house in the Netherlands and one to pick up a tiny house in the eastern part of Belgium. So literally across the country. The farm isn't located next to a big street. We live behind the rest of the houses of the village, and the only entryway onto the domain is a small alley from around 3.5 meters wide. Knowing some of the containers are more than 3 meters wide, we knew it would be a tight fit. In May of 2023, the first delivery was planned. We spent hours preparing where the first tiny house would be. We planned for it to stand in the garden between the trees. So we measured everything and prepared the ground by laying stepping stones as support for the containers. The 12th of May was the big day. Alex and Jasper went the day before to help the previous owners to take apart the tiny house. It consists of 3 containers of 2.5 by 6.5 and 1 little wooden shack that can be used as an entrance hall. There was also a wooden construction to build the roof back up. Every part was loaded onto the trucks and started its way towards our farm. When the trucks arrived, it quickly became clear that we wouldn't be able to put the house in the garden. It was too soggy, it would sink into the grass, and so on. We had to move quickly to measure everything all over again on the courtyard to see if we could fit the 2 tiny houses and still have enough space for all the construction trucks to move around. Eventually, we were ready for the containers to be placed onto the pavement of the courtyard. It was raining like crazy that day, and by noon we were all soaked and cold. The placement of the containers was entertaining though. The truck had a crane that could lift them up over half the courtyard and put them in the right spot. When everything was in its place, we noticed that the container on the left was 12 centimeters too far away from the middle one. Now we had to move this 3 tons worth of steel with all the strength we had left. It wouldn't budge at first, but luckily one of the guys from the transport company brought something they called a pence, and with just those 60 centimeters of steel we could move the container. Very impressive. Now we still had to close everything up, so the 3 containers have to be attached at their corners with some kind of mega bolt. Finally, every crack had to be filled with insulating foam. At the end of the day, we had a tiny house in the middle of our courtyard. That's actually crazy to think about. The next day, we had to fix the roof and clean the entire inside of the house because of the rain of the previous day. I could finally see what it would become and how we could make this a nice home. Spoiler alert, this inside would go in ups and downs in the next few weeks. 2 weeks later, some extreme summer rains made their way through the country. Alex and Eline lived in the eastern part of Belgium with family until the tiny houses were equipped with water and gas. That's when they got a phone call. The entire tiny house was flooded. Water was bursting through the roof and everything was soaking wet. We tried to do some damage control, but most damage was done. The reason for this massive leak was a delayed transport of the extra roof construction. So, the tiny house did have a flat roof, but it was old and damaged. So the previous owners made a roof with corrugated iron. However, the transportation company forgot to take those iron plates on the day of the move. And you don't just put 6-meter long plates in your car. They promised to deliver them a week later, but obviously they did not. Eventually, the roof was delivered 3 weeks later and we could finally make our home waterproof. A little over a month later, the next tiny house was on the move. We did this before, so we thought we got this. Oh boy, were we wrong. This tiny house was actually a lot easier to assemble because it only had one small contact point instead of 2 big ones like the other house. They started bright and early by loading everything onto the trucks. Again, a caravan of trucks arrived at our farm. By then our neighbors were really starting to ask questions and coming over to see what on earth was happening. A few days earlier, Alex and some of our dads saw 3 posts that separated 2 entryways to the farm. This part of the road was a bit broader, so the truck driver preferred it this way. The city council gave us permission to take away the posts on one condition. We had to put them back.
Zat er spel in? We hebben eigenlijk gewoon dus met een betel eerst begonnen. En dan hebben we met de sleepscheven alles rond het centrum en we weggedaan. We hebben eigenlijk een kunstwerk van gemaakt. Dus
So we weren't exactly sure how to put them back after sewing them off, but those were worries for later. The containers from Andrea Zamorgan's tiny house were 30 centimeters wider than the previous ones from Alex and Eline. So everyone was stressed to see if they would fit through the alleyway. And that stress was justified. Even at the beginning of the alley, we could see it wouldn't fit. Coming through the other entrance wasn't an option since this one was even smaller. We had to break a concrete fence and push it to the side. We had to cut a part of the stem of a tree and we cut off branches. And when we seemed to have gotten through the bottleneck, we saw the lantern next to the street bending towards the fence. I think the truck took more than an hour getting through, let's say, 20 meters. But eventually, the truck got through the alley and onto the courtyard. I think all of us were looking for other tiny houses on the internet already, but we were so relieved when all 3 containers got onto the domain. As we knew beforehand, this tiny house was a lot easier to assemble, so at the end of the day we had a village of tiny houses in our courtyard. Not without hurdles, but happy with the result. The second half of June, we worked our asses off to get electricity, water and internet in the tiny houses. To make this happen, we had to cut open the alley, dig a ditch of 80 centimeters deep, pull conduit pipes and pull the electricity and internet wires through it. For the internet, we tried to set up a network with access points in every house. They are virtually divided into separate virtual networks. We used the month of July and most of our free time in it to give the containers a fresher look. For Alex and Eline, it was mostly cleaning and drying out the furniture from the water damage. Andrea Zamorgan assembled their dads to renovate the bathroom and paint the entire tiny house. They also put in a new floor and a kitchen island. Now, looking back, the adventure of installing the tiny houses wasn't without hurdles, but we are so happy with the result. We were able to create 2 cozy, safe homes from 6 containers and some paint. Moving everything from our big houses into the tiny-whiny spaces of the tiny house was a challenge that we might possibly discuss in another video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next one.